Today we're going to be talking about section 4.6, which is on the quadratic formula and the discriminant. So the quadratic formula is this equation right here, and it can be used to solve for our values of x, or our solutions to a quadratic problem. Quadratic equation looks like this. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So for example, if we look at our quadratic equation in standard form, notice it has to be equal to 0. We have an a in front of the x squared, we have a b in front of the x, and we have a c, a constant at the end. Again, it has to be equal to 0. Then what I can do is I can just plug these numbers, b, b, a, c, a, right there, into my quadratic equation. So for example, here's this one right here. So in our case, a is going to be 1, b is going to be 5, and c is going to be 6. Notice it's equal to 0. So then it would be negative b, so negative 5, plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 6 all over 2 times 1. And the thing is this is going to give us two distinct answers because we have the plus or minus symbol right there. That's how we get two answers. Like we said before, quadratics generally have two answers. And so that's how we get it right there, the plus or minus sign. So let's look at an example. Example 1 says to find two rational roots for this equation, x squared minus 10x equals 11, by using the quadratic formula. Now the important thing to look at in this one is that you'll see it's equal to 11. We always want our standard forms, if we're solving quadratics, to be equal to 0. So I need to subtract 11 from both sides of the equal sign, and I get this equation out. X squared minus 10x minus 11 equals 0. So now notice it's equal to 0. So if I'm going to find out what a, b, and c are, a would be the number in front of x squared. In our case, it's going to be 1. B is going to be negative 10. Notice I use the minus sign in there. Negative 10. And so C you can figure out is minus 11. Again, I use the minus sign, and so that's going to be my negative 11 right there. So my quadratic equation is this. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug my numbers into my quadratic equation where they belong. First one, negative b. Well, since I have negative 10, negative 10 is just a positive 10, plus or minus the square root of negative 10 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 11, all over 2 times a, which in our case is 1. Okay, so now we've just plugged our numbers in just like that. Okay, and so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to simplify as much as I can, and then I can go to my calculator. So first, 10 plus or minus square root of, well, negative 10 squared is 100 minus, and then 4 times 1 is 4 times negative 11 is negative 44 all over 2 times 1 is 2. Now minus and negative you'll see changes to adding. So 100 plus 44 would be plus or minus the square root of 144 all over 2. The square root of 144 is a perfect square. Square root of 144 is 12. So now I'm down to 10, x equals 10 plus or minus 12 over 2. So my two solutions become this. X equals 10 plus 12 is 22 over 2, which is equal to 11. Okay, so x equals 11 is one of them. Then the other one, 10 minus 12 is equal to negative 2 over 2, which would be negative 1. So my other solution is negative 1. Now we could check this. This would be an easy one to check by graphing. We could graph this in our, go to y equals, put in x squared minus 10x minus 11, graph it, see where it crosses the x-axis. You'll see it crosses at positive 11 and negative 1. We can always check our answers. Here's a couple guided practice problems that you can try with the quadratic formula as well. Now, let's look at this one right here. X squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 0. So again, I find out what my A is. A is 1. B, positive 8. So I'll just write 8. And C, positive 16. So I'll write 16. I plug them into the quadratic equation. Again, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now when it comes to the NCA test, when you take it as juniors, they actually give you the quadratic formula. So you don't have to worry about memorizing this. Okay? So negative b, so it would be negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 16 all over 2 times 1. Okay? Let's simplify it out. Okay? Negative 8 plus or minus the square root of, well, 8 squared is 64 minus 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 16 is 64 all over 2 times 1, which is 2. So you'll notice 64 minus 64 is actually 0. So when we get down to here, we get x equals negative 8 plus or minus 0 over 2. Okay, well, negative 8 plus 0 is negative 8, and negative 8 minus 0 is negative 8. So there's actually only one solution to this one. And so that would be negative 8 over 2, which would be negative 4. My only solution, this one has one solution, it's negative 4. Now you'll notice that since we have the same number under the square root, 64 and 64, you get 0. And so whenever you have 0 under the square root, that's when you're only going to have one solution. And we'll talk about why that is later in the section. Here's a couple guided practice problems that you can try as well. Now example 3. Now we're going to start talking about irrational roots. And there's going to be times where this happens. So let's take a look at this one. Okay? So it's already equal to 0, so I don't have to change anything. So now I'll just start writing down A, B, and C. So A in this case is going to be 2, B is going to be positive 6, and C is going to be negative 7. So I put them into my quadratic equation. Remember, that's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I plug my numbers in where they belong. So b is 6. So I'd have negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 7 all over 2 times 2. Okay, that's actually supposed to be 2 instead of 1. So now I have it all plugged in. I put in all my numbers where they belong. So let's simplify. Okay, so it'd be negative 6 plus or minus the square root of, well, 6 squared is 36 minus 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times negative 7 is a negative 56. All over 2 times 2 is 4 on the bottom this time. So again, we can simplify. You'll see that minus and negative is adding. So I get negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 plus 56 is going to be 92 all over 4. Now this is a great example of when your calculator can come in handy. Now you can write your answers in forms of square roots if you'd like. Otherwise, I think it's easier to work with decimals. So I'll go to my calculator and I'll put in negative 6 plus the square root of 92. And then I divide that by 4. And so my first answer, when I do plus, negative 6 plus the square root of 92 over 4, my solution is going to be 0.898. Okay? And I'll go 3 decimal places. My next solution, x equals negative 6 minus the square root of 92 all over 4. So negative 6 minus the square root of 92 divided by 4. And then I get negative 3.989. So my two solutions right here are decimals, and they are these two as well. So is it okay to get a decimal for your solution? It is. It is okay to get that. All right. Example 4 has to do with complex roots. So let's take a look at this one. Now you'll notice in this equation right here, it's not equal to 0, it's equal to negative 10. So I'm going to add 10 to both sides of my equation. When I do that, I get x squared minus 6x plus 10 equals 0. Now that it's equal to 0, I can start figuring out my a, b, and c. A is 1, b is negative 6, and c is 10. And so I go to my equation right here, negative b minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Plug my numbers in. Okay, so b is negative 6. So negative 6 is going to be 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared would be negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10 all over 2 times 1. So let's simplify. Okay, so 6 plus or minus the square root of, well, negative 6 squared is 36 minus 4 times 1 times 10 is 40 all over 2. Now you'll notice on the bottom there, or in my underneath my square root, 36 minus 40 is going to give me a negative number. So 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 all over 2. Now if you want to find out what the square root of a negative number is, you can do that on your calculator. Make sure it's set up so that you can read complex numbers. But square root of a negative is I, square root of 4 is 2. So I would get 6 plus or minus 2i over 2. So my two answers are going to be x equals, well, 6 plus 2i over 2 simplifies to 3 plus I. That's one of my solutions. The next one is 6 minus 2i over 2. And so that would be 3 minus I. And again, you'll notice those are complex conjugates of each other. If you have a plus an I, you have to have a minus the same I. So it makes sense that we'd have 3 plus I and 3 minus I. Here's a couple guided practice problems that you can also try.